Deep in the haunted hollows of Appalachia, where blood-soaked secrets whisper through the pines, join us to uncover chilling tales of terror and make sure you hit that subscribe button to never miss another nightmare. On a cold October morning in 1892, a Kentucky circuit judge named Marcus Whitwell wrote in his personal journal, "There are places in these mountains where decent, law-fearing folk dare not venture, not because of bears or wildcats, but because certain family names carry a darkness that seems to infect the very soil they walk upon." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. Deep in the fog-shrouded hollers of Appalachia, where federal marshals feared to tread and county sheriffs turned blind eyes, 6 family dynasties had built their own brutal kingdoms through blood, terror, and unimaginable violence. These weren't simple feuding clans or mountain folk defending their territory. These were organized criminal empires that operated with such calculated savagery that their very existence was deliberately erased from official records. For over a century, their stories were buried as deep as their victims, until now. The Hatfield-McCoy feud might be the most famous Appalachian conflict in history textbooks, but it was merely a footnote compared to the systematic reign of terror unleashed by families whose names were spoken only in whispers. Today, we're uncovering the blood-soaked legacy of 6 family dynasties who didn't just break the law. They became the law in their remote mountain territories. These are the stories that government officials classified, that newspapers refused to print, and that surviving witnesses took to their graves rather than speak aloud. Before we dive into these chilling accounts, make sure to subscribe because what you're about to learn has never been compiled in one place before. These are the true crime stories that shaped the dark heart of American mountain culture, and each family on this list left behind a trail of bodies that numbered in the dozens, if not hundreds. Number 6, the Toiver-Martin war machine of Rowan County. Between 1884 and 1887, Rowan County, Kentucky became the epicenter of what historians now recognize as the most systematic campaign of political assassination in 19th century America. Unlike typical family feuds that erupted over personal slights, the Toiver-Martin conflict was a calculated war for political and economic control that left the county government completely paralyzed and the streets of Moorhead literally running with blood. The violence began when Craig Tolliver, a man described by contemporaries as having the calculating mind of a general and the heart of a rattlesnake, decided that Rowan County would be run by his family or no one at all. Tolliver had returned from the Civil War with military experience and a network of equally ruthless men who had learned that violence was often the most efficient solution to complex problems. What set the Tollivers apart from other mountain families wasn't just their willingness to kill, but their systematic approach to eliminating opposition. The Martin family, led by the equally dangerous Floyd Martin, controlled the opposing political faction and had their own network of armed supporters. What followed wasn't a feud in any traditional sense, but rather an organized campaign of terror that saw both families employing tactics that wouldn't have been out of place in a modern insurgency. They used coordinated ambushes, targeted assassinations of government officials, and psychological warfare designed to break the will of anyone who might oppose them. The violence reached its peak during what became known as the Moorhead Massacre of June 1887. Craig Tolliver and his men had essentially taken over the town, patrolling the streets with rifles and conducting their own version of martial law. When a circuit court judge arrived to hold session, accompanied by several law enforcement officers from outside the county, Toiver made the decision that would ultimately seal his fate. He and his men opened fire on the courthouse steps, killing the judge, 2 deputy sheriffs, and 3 civilians who happened to be nearby. The massacre finally drew state attention that even the Toivers couldn't intimidate or corrupt. Within weeks, Kentucky's governor had declared martial law and sent in state militia forces with orders to restore order by any means necessary. The final confrontation came when Craig Toiver and several family members barricaded themselves in a local hotel, turning it into a fortress. State forces surrounded the building, and after a 12-hour siege that left the structure riddled with bullet holes, Toiver and 4 of his men were found dead. But the true horror of the Toiver-Martin conflict wasn't just the body count, which historians estimate reached at least 37 documented deaths. It was the systematic way both families had terrorized an entire county into submission. They had created their own courts, their own laws, and their own methods of enforcement that relied entirely on the threat of immediate and brutal retaliation. For 3 years, Rowan County existed essentially outside the United States legal system, controlled by 2 criminal organizations that happened to share family names. The aftermath revealed the true scope of their operations. Hidden weapons caches were discovered throughout the county, along with detailed lists of political enemies and evidence of an elaborate spy network that had infiltrated local businesses, churches, and even family structures. Both the Toivers and Martins had been planning not just to control Rowan County, but to expand their influence throughout eastern Kentucky using the same tactics of systematic intimidation and violence. Most chilling were the testimonies that emerged after the violence ended. Witnesses described how both families had essentially turned murder into a business operation, with specific members assigned to carry out assassinations, while others handled the logistics of disposing of bodies and intimidating witnesses. They had created what modern law enforcement would recognize as organized crime syndicates, complete with hierarchies, territorial divisions, and codes of silence enforced through the promise of immediate and brutal retaliation. Even today, more than a century later, historians struggle to determine the exact number of people killed during the Toiver-Martin conflict. Many bodies were never found, and witnesses who survived often took their knowledge to the grave rather than risk speaking about what they had seen. The official records from those 3 years are remarkably incomplete, with entire months where no births, deaths, or legal proceedings were recorded, as if the county had simply ceased to exist as a functioning part of the state. The legacy of the Toiver-Martin War extends far beyond the immediate violence. It demonstrated how quickly isolated mountain communities could descend into what was essentially warlord-controlled territory when traditional law enforcement proved inadequate. More disturbing, it showed how family-based criminal organizations could evolve sophisticated methods of control that combined traditional mountain loyalty with military-style organization and a complete willingness to use extreme violence as a first resort rather than a last one. Some historians argue that the Toiver-Martin conflict served as a blueprint for other Appalachian criminal dynasties that followed. The combination of family loyalty, territorial control, systematic intimidation, and the exploitation of geographic isolation would be repeated again and again throughout the mountains over the following decades. In many ways, Craig Tolliver and Floyd Martin weren't just mountain feudists. They were pioneers of American organized crime who happened to operate in the hollers of Kentucky rather than the streets of Chicago or New York. The few surviving descendants of both families left the region entirely after the violence ended, many changing their names and moving to distant states. But local residents of Rowan County continued to find evidence of their presence for decades afterward. Weapons caches were discovered as late as the 1920s, hidden in caves and buried in locations that suggested both families had been preparing for a much longer and more extensive conflict than what actually occurred. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that if state intervention hadn't ended the Toiver-Martin War when it did, eastern Kentucky might have seen the emergence of something resembling the criminal territories that would later develop in other parts of Appalachia. Both families had demonstrated that they could completely override local government, terrorize civilian populations into submission, and create their own systems of law and order based entirely on the threat of violence. They had, in effect, created a template for criminal control that would unfortunately prove remarkably durable in the isolated mountain communities of Appalachia. The Toiver-Martin conflict stands as perhaps the clearest example of how quickly family-based criminal organizations could evolve from simple feuding into something approaching domestic terrorism. Their willingness to target government officials, their systematic approach to eliminating opposition, and their complete disregard for civilian casualties marked them as qualitatively different from the typical mountain families who might engage in occasional violence to settle personal disputes. They had crossed the line from criminal families into something more dangerous, criminal dynasties with the organizational capability and ruthless determination to challenge the authority of the state itself. And they were only the beginning of what these mountains would produce. Number 5. The Malone Dynasty of Massacre Ridge. In the winter of 1889, a federal marshal named Thomas Brennan disappeared while investigating reports of missing tax collectors in the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee. His final telegraph to Washington read simply, "The Malones don't just kill their enemies, they erase them from existence entirely. Send no one else." 3 more federal agents vanished over the following months, their horses found wandering riderless, their weapons scattered across mountain trails, but their bodies never recovered. The investigation was quietly abandoned, and Massacre Ridge was marked on federal maps with a notation that still exists today: area under local jurisdiction, indefinitely. The Malone family had arrived in Tennessee sometime around 1870, though no official records document their origins or immigration. What made them immediately distinctive wasn't just their ruthless efficiency in eliminating threats, but their systematic approach to controlling information. Unlike other mountain families who relied on isolation for protection, the Malones actively cultivated a network of fear that extended far beyond their immediate territory. They understood that true power came not just from the ability to kill, but from the ability to make people believe that death was the least terrible thing that could happen to those who crossed them. The family was led by patriarch Silas Malone, a man described by the few surviving witnesses as possessing an almost supernatural ability to read people's intentions and weaknesses. Silas had supposedly served in the Civil War, though military records contain no mention of anyone by that name in any regiment from either side. What is documented is his uncanny ability to predict exactly how local officials, law enforcement, and even federal agents would attempt to approach his territory, allowing him to neutralize threats before they materialized. The Malones operated what can only be described as a comprehensive intelligence network throughout eastern Tennessee and portions of Kentucky and Virginia. They had informants in sheriff's departments, federal offices, railroad companies, and telegraph stations. More disturbing, they seemed to have advanced knowledge of government operations that should have been classified at the highest levels. When revenue agents planned raids on moonshine operations, the Malones knew about them days in advance. When federal marshals received orders to investigate missing persons reports, the family was already preparing countermeasures. Their methods of elimination went far beyond simple murder. The Malones specialized in what they called complete erasure, a process that removed not just their victims, but any trace that those people had ever existed. They would systematically destroy personal belongings, falsify records, intimidate witnesses into silence, and create alternative explanations for disappearances that were so plausible that even family members of the missing eventually accepted them. They had perfected the art of making people vanish so thoroughly that within months it was as if they had never lived at all. The family's most notorious operation occurred in the spring of 1892, when a circuit court judge named Marcus Whitwell arrived in the region to investigate reports of systematic corruption in local government. Judge Whitwell was accompanied by 2 federal marshals and a court reporter, and had brought with him documented evidence of the Malone family's criminal activities. The entire party checked into a hotel in the town of Cedar Creek on a Tuesday evening. By Thursday morning, the hotel registry showed no record of their visit. The innkeeper claimed never to have seen them, and even their horses had vanished from the stable. More chilling was what happened to the official records they had brought. Documents that had been carefully compiled over months of investigation were found altered in government archives, with the Malone name removed entirely and replaced with references to other families. Court stenographers discovered that their notes from previous proceedings had been modified overnight, changing testimony and evidence in ways that completely exonerated the Malones of any wrongdoing. It was as if the family possessed the ability to reach back through time and modify reality itself. The Malones maintained their control through a combination of strategic violence and psychological warfare that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They never killed randomly or out of passion. Every elimination served multiple purposes, removing a specific threat, sending a message to potential future threats, and reinforcing their reputation for supernatural abilities. They would often leave behind deliberate clues that their victims had met fates worse than simple death, encouraging witnesses to imagine horrors that were probably more effective than any actual torture. Their compound on Massacre Ridge was described by the few who claimed to have seen it as more fortress than family homestead. Multiple defensive positions, hidden weapon caches, and underground tunnels that connected to caves throughout the mountain created a stronghold that would have been nearly impossible for even military forces to assault successfully. But more importantly, the family had created escape routes that allowed them to vanish entirely if their position ever became untenable. The Malones understood that their greatest weapon was their reputation. Stories spread throughout the mountains of their supernatural abilities, their connections to dark forces, and their power to curse entire bloodlines. Whether these stories were true or carefully cultivated propaganda didn't matter. The effect was the same: complete psychological dominance over anyone who might consider opposing them. People would cross themselves when their name was mentioned and would go miles out of their way to avoid traveling through areas under Malone influence. What made the family particularly dangerous was their long-term strategic thinking. Unlike other criminal organizations that focused on immediate profits or territorial control, the Malones seemed to be building something more comprehensive. They systematically eliminated or corrupted local officials, replaced them with people under their control, and gradually extended their influence into legitimate business and government operations. They were creating what amounted to their own shadow state within the official boundaries of Tennessee. The family's operations extended far beyond their mountain territory. They had connections to criminal organizations in major cities, political figures at the state level, and business interests that gave them influence over railroads, mining operations, and timber companies. Evidence suggests they were involved in vote manipulation, jury tampering, and the systematic corruption of legal proceedings throughout eastern Tennessee. They had essentially created a parallel justice system where their word was law and their enemies simply ceased to exist. The end of the Malone dynasty came not through law enforcement action, but through what appeared to be internal conflict. In the winter of 1895, residents of nearby communities reported hearing gunfire from Massacre Ridge that continued intermittently for 3 days. When the shooting finally stopped, the compound was found abandoned with evidence of a violent struggle but no bodies. The family had simply vanished, taking with them their weapons, their records, and any evidence of their activities. Some historians believe the Malones were betrayed by members of their own organization who had grown tired of their increasingly paranoid and controlling behavior. Others suggest they were eliminated by federal agents operating under such deep cover that no official records were ever created. The most disturbing theory is that they weren't eliminated at all, but simply decided their mission in Tennessee was complete and moved their operations to another region where they could continue their work under different identities. The legacy of the Malone family extends far beyond their immediate crimes. They had demonstrated that a relatively small criminal organization could effectively challenge the authority of the federal government if they combined ruthless violence with sophisticated intelligence gathering and psychological warfare. They had shown how to make people disappear so completely that their absence became easier to accept than their existence had been to acknowledge. The techniques pioneered by the Malones would later be recognized in other criminal organizations throughout Appalachia and beyond. The systematic corruption of records, the comprehensive elimination of enemies, and the cultivation of supernatural reputations became hallmarks of organized crime families that understood that true power came from controlling information as much as controlling territory. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that the Malones may have been more successful than anyone realized. Their ability to erase evidence of their activities means that historians are still discovering criminal operations that bear their distinctive signatures. Cold cases from the 1880s and 1890s throughout the southeastern United States contain elements that suggest Malone involvement, missing persons whose disappearances were too complete, government officials whose deaths were too convenient, and criminal investigations that were abandoned too quickly. The Malone dynasty represents the evolution of Appalachian criminal families from simple mountain feudists to sophisticated organized crime syndicates capable of challenging government authority on multiple levels. They understood that in an age of increasing federal oversight and communication technology, survival required not just the ability to hide in remote mountains, but the ability to manipulate the systems that were designed to track and prosecute them. Even today, law enforcement officials studying historical organized crime patterns recognize the Malone methods in modern criminal organizations. The systematic elimination of witnesses, the corruption of official records, and the cultivation of reputations so fearsome that victims often participate in their own victimization have become standard practices for criminal families that understand the psychological dimensions of power. The few surviving records of the Malone dynasty were classified by the federal government in 1923 and remain largely sealed today. Official explanations cite ongoing security concerns and protection of investigative methods, but historians suspect the real reason is more disturbing. The Malones may have been so successful at documenting the corruption they fostered that releasing their records would implicate government officials and prominent families whose descendants still hold positions of power and influence. In the end, the Malone dynasty achieved something that few criminal organizations ever manage. They became more powerful in legend than they had been in reality. Their reputation for supernatural abilities and complete ruthlessness continued to influence criminal behavior in Appalachia long after their disappearance, creating a template for organized crime that emphasized psychological dominance and systematic elimination of opposition. They had proven that in the right circumstances, a criminal family could become so feared that reality itself seemed to bend around their will, making them not just outlaws, but architects of their own twisted version of justice. Number 4. The Ashford Empire of Blood Mountain. In the mountains of North Georgia, where the morning mist never quite lifts and the soil has a peculiar reddish tint that locals blame on iron deposits, the Ashford family built what federal investigators would later describe as the most sophisticated criminal operation in Appalachian history. Between 1898 and 1934, 3 generations of Ashfords transformed a remote wilderness area into their personal kingdom, complete with their own courts, their own currency, and their own brutal system of justice that made the Hatfield-McCoy feud look like a neighborhood dispute. The Ashford dynasty began with Cornelius Ashford, a man whose background remains mysteriously absent from all official records. He appeared in the region around 1897, purchasing thousands of acres of seemingly worthless mountain land with gold coins of unknown origin. Within months, he had constructed not just a family compound, but an entire infrastructure that included a private railroad spur, telegraph lines, in what appeared to be a small town designed specifically to house his growing criminal organization. What set the Ashfords apart from other mountain families wasn't just their scale of operation, but their systematic approach to eliminating any form of outside authority. Cornelius understood that true criminal power required the complete absence of legitimate law enforcement, and he set about achieving this goal with methodical precision. County sheriffs who attempted to patrol Ashford territory were found days later, their bodies arranged in ways that served as warnings to their replacements. Federal revenue agents who investigated reports of massive moonshine operations simply vanished, their horses returning riderless to their home stations. The family's criminal empire operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the surface, they ran what appeared to be legitimate businesses, logging operations, small-scale mining, and agricultural ventures that provided cover for their real activities. Beneath this facade, they controlled the largest moonshine distribution network in the southeastern United States, with production facilities hidden throughout their mountain territory and distribution routes that extended into major cities from Atlanta to Baltimore. But moonshine was merely the foundation of the Ashford Empire. By the early 1900s, they had expanded into human trafficking, operating what federal investigators would later discover was a network of forced labor camps hidden throughout their territory. Workers were recruited from cities with promises of good-paying jobs in the mountains, only to find themselves trapped in remote facilities where they were forced to work in dangerous conditions with no hope of escape. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down by teams of Ashford enforcers who knew the mountain terrain better than any outsider could hope to. The Ashfords had also created their own monetary system within their territory. They minted crude coins bearing the family seal and issued paper currency that was accepted at all businesses under their control. More disturbing, they had established exchange rates with legitimate currency that were enforced through violence. Anyone caught refusing Ashford money or attempting to devalue it faced immediate and brutal punishment. This economic control allowed them to maintain absolute authority over everyone who lived or worked within their sphere of influence. Their approach to law enforcement was equally systematic. The Ashfords maintained their own police force, complete with uniforms, badges, and authority that was recognized throughout their territory. These enforcers had the power to arrest, try, and execute anyone accused of crimes against the family or their interests. They operated their own courthouse, complete with judges who were either family members or individuals whose loyalty had been secured through threats or bribery. The trials held in this courthouse were elaborate affairs that maintained the appearance of legitimate legal proceedings while ensuring outcomes that served Ashford interests. Witnesses who testified against the family's interests frequently disappeared before verdicts were rendered. Juries were carefully selected from among people whose families lived within Ashford territory, ensuring their cooperation through implicit threats. The sentences handed down were often creative in their brutality, designed not just to punish, but to send messages that would maintain order throughout their criminal kingdom. Federal authorities first became aware of the true scope of the Ashford Empire in 1923, when a postal inspector investigating mail theft discovered evidence of the family's private railroad operations. What began as a routine investigation quickly revealed a criminal organization so sophisticated that it operated essentially as an independent nation within the borders of Georgia. The Postal Inspector's report, which was immediately classified, described a territory where federal law simply didn't exist, replaced by a system of criminal governance that was more efficient and more brutal than anything in official American jurisprudence. The investigation that followed was unlike anything federal law enforcement had previously undertaken. It required the coordination of multiple agencies, including the Treasury Department, the Postal Service, the Bureau of Investigation, and eventually military personnel who were brought in to provide security for investigators who had received credible death threats. The scope of evidence they uncovered was staggering. Detailed financial records showing millions of dollars in illegal profits, correspondence with criminal organizations throughout the United States, and documentation of murders that numbered in the hundreds. Most shocking were the records the Ashfords had kept of their human trafficking operations. They maintained detailed inventories of workers, including their skills, physical condition, and projected life expectancy under various working conditions. They had calculated the optimal balance between worker productivity and mortality rates, treating human beings as expendable resources to be used efficiently and discarded when no longer useful. Some of these workers had been held for decades, their families never knowing what had happened to them. The family's influence extended far beyond their mountain territory. Investigation revealed that they had corrupted officials at every level of government, from local sheriffs to federal judges. They had systematically identified and exploited the weaknesses of anyone in a position of authority, using bribery, blackmail, and threats to ensure their cooperation. In some cases, they had simply replaced inconvenient officials with their own people, using violence and intimidation to force resignations and then installing candidates who would serve their interests. Their network of corruption was so extensive that the federal investigation itself was repeatedly compromised. Information about planned raids was leaked to the family, allowing them to relocate evidence and eliminate witnesses before authorities arrived. Several investigators reported being followed and threatened, while others discovered that their personal information had been obtained and used to threaten their families. The Ashfords had created an intelligence network that rivaled anything operated by legitimate government agencies. The end of the Ashford Empire came not through law enforcement action, but through internal conflict that federal investigators later realized had been deliberately fostered by a covert operation that remains classified to this day. In the spring of 1934, fighting broke out between different branches of the Ashford family over control of their criminal enterprises. What began as a dispute over territory and profits quickly escalated into open warfare that destroyed much of their infrastructure and killed dozens of family members. The federal raid that finally ended Ashford control occurred during this internal conflict, when law enforcement was able to exploit the chaos to arrest surviving family members and seize control of their territory. Even then, the operation required over 300 federal agents and military personnel, supported by aircraft and armored vehicles. The resistance they encountered was fierce and well organized, confirming that the Ashfords had essentially created their own army to defend their criminal kingdom. The evidence seized during the raid filled entire warehouses and provided investigators with a comprehensive picture of how the Ashford Empire had operated. They discovered detailed plans for expanding their territory into adjacent states, correspondence with international criminal organizations, and evidence that they had been developing new forms of criminal enterprise that hadn't been seen before in the United States. The scope of their ambitions was truly staggering. They hadn't just been content to control their mountain territory, but had been planning to establish similar criminal kingdoms throughout the southeastern United States. Perhaps most disturbing were the psychological profiles that investigators discovered among the family's records. The Ashfords had conducted detailed studies of the communities under their control, documenting the most effective methods of maintaining obedience through fear and intimidation. They had identified the precise combination of brutality and occasional mercy that would keep populations compliant, and they had refined these techniques over decades of practice. They understood human psychology in ways that allowed them to maintain control over thousands of people with minimal resistance. The trials of surviving Ashford family members were conducted under extraordinary security measures, with witnesses protected by federal marshals and proceedings held in courthouses that were essentially under military guard. Even then, several witnesses died under mysterious circumstances, and others simply disappeared before they could testify. The family's network of corruption and intimidation continued to function even after their arrest, demonstrating the depth of their influence throughout the region. The few Ashford family members who survived the federal raids and subsequent trials scattered to different parts of the country, many changing their names and attempting to disappear into urban areas where their mountain origins wouldn't be recognized. But law enforcement agencies continued to monitor them for decades, recognizing that their knowledge and experience made them uniquely dangerous. Some investigators believed that former Ashford operatives were involved in the development of organized crime syndicates in major cities, bringing their sophisticated understanding of criminal organization to urban environments. The Ashford territory itself was placed under federal control for several years following the raids, with military personnel stationed throughout the region to prevent any attempt at re-establishing criminal control. The facilities they had built were systematically destroyed, their private railroad was dismantled, and their mining and logging operations were shut down permanently. Even today, nearly a century later, large portions of their former territory remain undeveloped, as if the land itself retains some residual taint from their criminal activities. The legacy of the Ashford Empire extends far beyond their immediate crimes. They had demonstrated that a criminal organization could achieve a level of sophistication and control that rivaled legitimate government institutions. Their systematic approach to corruption, their understanding of human psychology, and their willingness to use extreme violence in service of long-term strategic goals created a template that would influence organized crime development throughout the 20th century. Modern law enforcement officials studying the Ashford case recognize elements of their methodology in contemporary criminal organizations. The systematic corruption of officials, the creation of alternative economic systems, and the use of psychological manipulation to maintain control over large populations have become standard practices for sophisticated criminal syndicates worldwide. In many ways, the Ashfords were pioneers of modern organized crime, developing techniques and strategies that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of international criminal cartels decades later. The federal government's handling of the Ashford case also established precedents for dealing with criminal organizations that challenged government authority on a fundamental level. The coordination between multiple agencies, the use of military personnel in domestic law enforcement operations, and the extraordinary security measures employed during their prosecution created a framework that would be used again when dealing with other large-scale criminal enterprises. The Ashford case was in many ways the first modern organized crime investigation in American history. The complete records of the Ashford investigation remain partially classified to this day, with some documents sealed under national security provisions that have never been fully explained. Some historians believe this continued secrecy suggests that aspects of the Ashford operation involved foreign governments or international criminal organizations in ways that could still compromise national security if revealed. Others speculate that the methods used to bring down the Ashford Empire included illegal or unconstitutional activities that the government prefers to keep hidden. What remains certain is that the Ashford family represented the evolution of Appalachian criminal families from simple mountain feudists to sophisticated criminal enterprises capable of challenging government authority on multiple levels. They understood that true criminal power required not just the ability to commit crimes, but the ability to create alternative systems of governance, economics, and justice that could replace legitimate institutions entirely. In their remote mountain kingdom, they had successfully created what amounted to a criminal state, complete with all the apparatus of government, but dedicated entirely to illegal enterprise and the systematic oppression of anyone who challenged their authority. The Ashford Empire stands as perhaps the most complete example of how criminal families could exploit the isolation and weak governmental presence in Appalachia to create their own twisted version of civilization. They had proven that in the right circumstances, criminal organizations could evolve beyond simple law-breaking to become alternative forms of government, ruling through fear and brutality, but maintaining the organizational sophistication necessary to challenge legitimate authority on its own terms. Their legacy serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when criminal ambition combines with geographic isolation and governmental weakness to create opportunities for the most ruthless and intelligent criminals to build their own kingdoms of terror and exploitation. The sound of Federal Marshal Daniel Crawford's badge hitting the wooden floor echoed through the abandoned courthouse like a gunshot. It was October 15th, 1901, and Crawford had just witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. In his final report, smuggled out of Pike County by a telegraph operator who died under mysterious circumstances 3 days later, Crawford wrote, "The Murdoch clan doesn't just kill their enemies, they harvest them. What I seen in them caves ain't natural, and it ain't Christian neither. May God forgive us all for what we let grow in these mountains." The Murdoch dynasty had controlled a 30-square-mile territory in eastern Kentucky since the 1870s, but unlike other criminal families who relied on intimidation and violence, the Murdochs had perfected something far more sinister. They had turned human suffering into a science, and death into an art form that served purposes beyond simple elimination of enemies. They had discovered that terror, when properly cultivated and harvested, could be transformed into a source of power that transcended anything mere bullets and threats could achieve. What set the Murdochs apart wasn't just their systematic approach to violence, but their understanding that human fear and pain could be concentrated, stored, and utilized as a form of currency more valuable than gold or political influence. They had built their criminal empire on the foundation of psychological alchemy, transforming the raw material of human anguish into tools that allowed them to control not just individuals, but entire communities across multiple states. The family was led by patriarch Jeremiah Murdoch, a man whose background remained mysteriously absent from all military and civilian records, despite eyewitness accounts placing him at several major Civil War battles. Jeremiah possessed what survivors described as an almost supernatural ability to rid people's deepest fears and exploit them with surgical precision. But more disturbing than his psychological insights was his systematic approach to documenting and cataloging human responses to various forms of trauma. The Murdochs operated what can only be described as experimental facilities hidden throughout their mountain territory. These weren't simple torture chambers, but rather carefully designed laboratories where they studied the effects of prolonged psychological pressure on human subjects. They kept detailed records of how different types of stress affected their victims' behavior, how long it took to break down specific personality types, and most chillingly, how the presence of broken individuals could be used to terrorize others more effectively than any direct threat. Their methodology was both sophisticated and horrifying. The Murdochs would identify individuals who possessed influence or resources they desired, then systematically isolate them from support networks before beginning what they called the softening process. This involved exposing targets to carefully orchestrated experiences designed to erode their psychological defenses without leaving physical evidence. Witnesses who escaped described being forced to watch the systematic destruction of people they cared about, creating a form of trauma that made resistance psychologically impossible. The family's most notorious operation was centered around what they called the collection, a series of underground chambers carved into the limestone caves that honeycomb the Kentucky mountains. These spaces served multiple purposes, holding areas for victims, research facilities for their psychological experiments, and most disturbingly, exhibition areas where they displayed the results of their work to visitors who needed convincing of the Murdoch family's capabilities. Federal investigators, who later examined these chambers, found evidence of systematic documentation that rivaled anything produced by legitimate research institutions. The Murdochs had created detailed psychological profiles of hundreds of individuals, complete with assessments of their breaking points, their relationships with family members, and comprehensive plans for exploiting their weaknesses. They had essentially created a science of human destruction that allowed them to predict exactly how much pressure was needed to transform any individual into a compliant tool. What made the Murdoch operation particularly effective was their recruitment system. Rather than relying solely on family members, They had developed techniques for converting their victims into willing participants in their crimes. Through a combination of psychological manipulation, strategic applications of mercy and cruelty, and the systematic destruction of their targets' previous identities, the Murdochs created a network of broken individuals who served as both intelligence gatherers and enforcement agents. These converted agents were particularly valuable because they could move through normal society without arousing suspicion while carrying out missions that served Murdoch interests. They gathered information about potential targets, identified vulnerabilities in law enforcement operations, and most disturbingly, recruited new victims by exploiting the trust that came from their apparent normalcy. The Murdochs had essentially created an invisible army of psychologically damaged individuals who served their interests while believing they were making independent choices. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through what they called the network, a web of broken individuals, corrupted officials, and terrified communities that allowed them to project power across state lines. They had agents in sheriff's departments, federal offices, and even religious institutions who provided them with advance warning of investigations while simultaneously gathering intelligence about potential targets. More sophisticated than simple bribery or intimidation, the Murdoch network operated on the principle of psychological debt. They would identify individuals facing personal crises, offer assistance that came with seemingly minor obligations, then gradually escalate those obligations until their agents were completely compromised. The beauty of this system was that their agents often didn't realize they were working for the Murdochs until they were so deeply involved that escape seemed impossible. The network's most disturbing aspect was its self-perpetuating nature. Agents who successfully completed assignments were rewarded not just with money or protection, but with opportunities to inflict the same psychological destruction on others that had been inflicted on them. This created a cycle of trauma that spread Murdoch influence while simultaneously providing their agents with the psychological relief that came from transferring their pain to new victims. The family's control system was so sophisticated that they rarely needed to resort to direct violence. The mere knowledge that they possessed detailed psychological profiles of their enemies, combined with evidence of what happened to those who opposed them, was sufficient to maintain order throughout their territory. They had created what amounted to a totalitarian state based entirely on psychological terror, where resistance was prevented not by physical barriers, but by the certainty that opposition would result in forms of suffering worse than death. The Murdochs' most innovative contribution to criminal methodology was their understanding of intergenerational trauma. They recognized that destroying individuals was less efficient than destroying entire family lines, and they developed techniques for inflicting psychological damage that would be passed down through generations. Children who witnessed the destruction of their parents became adults whose own children inherited the psychological scars of trauma they hadn't directly experienced. This long-term approach allowed the Murdochs to maintain control over communities up long after their direct influence had ended. Families that had been broken by Murdoch operations often remained psychologically damaged for decades, creating communities of traumatized individuals who were psychologically incapable of mounting effective resistance against criminal authority. The Murdochs had essentially discovered how to weaponize inherited trauma as a form of social control. Their operations began attracting federal attention in 1898 when a pattern of mysterious disappearances and psychological breakdowns among law enforcement officials indicated the presence of a criminal organization unlike anything previously encountered. The investigation that followed required unprecedented coordination between multiple agencies and the development of new investigative techniques designed to combat psychological warfare rather than traditional criminal activity. What investigators discovered was a criminal empire that operated more like a psychological research institution than a traditional organized crime family. The Murdochs had created detailed studies of human behavior under extreme stress, developed innovative techniques for breaking down psychological resistance, and established systems for converting their victims into willing participants in their criminal enterprise. They had essentially pioneered forms of psychological manipulation that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern mind control techniques decades later. The investigation also revealed the true scope of the Murdoch network, which extended into over a dozen states and included agents in positions of significant authority within legitimate institutions. The family had created what amounted to a shadow government that operated through psychological control rather than political authority, influencing decisions made by officials who often didn't realize they were being manipulated. The end of the Murdoch dynasty came not through traditional law enforcement action, but through what federal records describe only as a special operation that remains classified to this day. In the winter of 1902, a team of federal agents with military support surrounded the Murdoch compound and engaged in what witnesses described as a siege that lasted 3 days. The exact details of what occurred during those 3 days have never been made public, but the operation resulted in the complete destruction of the Murdoch family and the systematic elimination of their research facilities. However, the aftermath of the Murdoch operation proved almost as disturbing as the original crimes. Many of the agents and community members who had been psychologically controlled by the family never recovered from their experiences. Some committed suicide, others suffered complete psychological breakdowns, and still others simply disappeared into remote areas where they could avoid human contact entirely. The Murdochs had created such extensive psychological damage that their destruction didn't end their influence, but rather spread it across a wider geographic area. Most troubling were the reports that some Murdoch agents had managed to escape the federal operation and establish new operations in distant states. Over the following decades, law enforcement agencies documented criminal activities that bore the distinctive psychological manipulation techniques pioneered by the Murdochs. The family had apparently trained some of their agents so thoroughly in their methods that they were capable of establishing their own psychological terror operations using Murdoch techniques. The federal government's response to the Murdoch case established precedents for dealing with criminal organizations that operated through psychological manipulation rather than traditional violence. Special training programs were developed for federal agents. New investigative techniques were created for combating psychological warfare, and protocols were established for protecting witnesses and agents from forms of manipulation that didn't involve physical threats. The complete records of the Murdoch investigation were immediately classified and remain largely sealed today. Official explanations cite ongoing security concerns and protection of investigative methods, but historians believe the real reason involves the disturbing implications of what the Murdochs had discovered about human psychology. Their research had apparently revealed techniques for psychological control that could be used by governments and institutions for purposes that went far beyond criminal enterprise. Some researchers believe that elements of Murdoch methodology were incorporated into government psychological research programs that developed during the early 20th century. The systematic documentation of human responses to psychological pressure, the techniques for breaking down individual resistance, and the methods for converting victims into willing agents all appeared in later government programs that studied psychological manipulation for intelligence and military purposes. The legacy of the Murdoch dynasty extends far beyond their immediate crimes into the fundamental understanding of how criminal organizations could exploit human psychology for purposes of control and influence. They had demonstrated that traditional law enforcement techniques were inadequate when dealing with criminals who understood how to weaponize human psychology, and their methods influenced the development of both criminal enterprises and law enforcement responses for decades to follow. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Murdoch case revealed how quickly isolated communities could be transformed into psychological laboratories when criminal organizations possess sufficient understanding of human behavior and sufficient time to implement their control systems. They had proven that physical force was often unnecessary when psychological manipulation could achieve the same results more efficiently and with less risk of outside intervention. The few surviving accounts of life under Murdoch control describe a form of existence that was neither freedom nor traditional captivity, but rather a psychological prison where victims participated in their own oppression while believing they were making independent choices. The family had created a system of control so sophisticated that resistance became psychologically impossible rather than simply dangerous. Modern law enforcement officials studying the Murdoch case recognize elements of their methodology in contemporary criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and cult movements. The systematic documentation of human psychological weaknesses, the conversion of victims into willing agents, and the use of trauma as a tool for social control have become standard practices for sophisticated criminal enterprises that understand the psychological dimensions of power and influence. The Murdoch dynasty represents the evolution of Appalachian criminal families from simple mountain outlaws to sophisticated psychological warfare specialists capable of creating alternative systems of social control that operated entirely through manipulation of human consciousness. They had proven that in the right circumstances, criminal organizations could achieve levels of control that rivaled legitimate governments without relying on traditional forms of authority or coercion. Their techniques for harvesting and weaponizing human suffering created a template for criminal enterprise that emphasized psychological domination over physical force, long-term control over immediate profits, and the systematic destruction of human resistance rather than simple elimination of enemies. The Murdochs had essentially created a form of criminal governance that operated through the manipulation of human psychology rather than the application of traditional power. Even today, Law enforcement agencies studying historical patterns of organized crime consider the Murdoch case to be one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American history. Their understanding of human psychology, their systematic approach to psychological manipulation, and their ability to create self-perpetuating systems of control established techniques that continue to influence criminal methodology more than a century after their destruction. The mountains of eastern Kentucky still bear the psychological scars of Murdoch influence, with some communities displaying patterns of behavior that suggest the intergenerational transmission of trauma inflicted more than a century ago. Local residents often display an unusual wariness of authority figures, an instinctive distrust of outsiders offering assistance, and a reluctance to discuss family histories that extends beyond normal mountain privacy into something approaching psychological compulsion. The Murdoch legacy serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when criminal ambition combines with sophisticated understanding of human psychology to create systems of control that operate below the level of conscious awareness. They had achieved something that few criminal organizations ever manage. They had made their victims grateful for their oppression while simultaneously making resistance psychologically impossible rather than simply dangerous. The investigation records that followed would haunt federal agents for decades to come. When authorities finally gained access to what they found in Murdoch territory, seasoned investigators who had seen the worst humanity could offer found themselves requesting immediate transfers to distant field offices. The scale of psychological manipulation they uncovered had created something unprecedented in American criminal history, a self-sustaining system of trauma that continued operating even after its architects were gone. But the Murdoch dynasty was merely the beginning of what these mountains would produce. Hidden deeper in the mist-shrouded peaks, where even the most hardened federal marshals feared to venture, another family had been perfecting methods of control that made the Murdochs' psychological warfare seem almost primitive by comparison. Number 3. The Kurther's bloodline of Devil's Backbone Ridge. In the winter of 1903, a telegraph operator in Hazard, Kentucky, received a message that would change everything anyone thought they knew about organized crime in America. The transmission, sent from a federal agent whose name was immediately classified, contained only 3 sentences that would be repeated in hushed whispers throughout federal law enforcement for the next half-century. The Kurthers don't just control people, they breed them. For God's sake, send no one else until we understand what we're dealing with. The Kurthers family had occupied Devil's Backbone Ridge since the 1850s, but unlike other mountain clans who maintained their influence through intimidation or economic control, the Kurthers had discovered something far more insidious. They had learned how to manipulate human genetics across generations, creating bloodlines of people who were psychologically and physically incapable of opposing their authority. They hadn't just built a criminal empire, they had engineered an entire population to serve as their willing slaves. The family's operation was discovered almost by accident when a routine census investigation in 1902 revealed mathematical impossibilities in the population records of 3 adjoining counties. Birth rates were inexplicably high, death rates were remarkably low, and most disturbing of all, genetic diversity had virtually disappeared across hundreds of families who showed no apparent relation to each other. When investigators began interviewing residents, they discovered that nearly every person in a 30-mile radius could trace their ancestry back to unions that had been arranged, encouraged, or in some cases forced by the Kurther's family over the previous 50 years. What made the Kurther's operation particularly sophisticated was their understanding that true control required multiple generations to achieve. Rather than relying on immediate violence or threats, they had systematically identified and cultivated specific genetic traits that made individuals more susceptible to psychological manipulation, more accepting of authority, and more likely to produce children who shared these characteristics. They had essentially created a controlled breeding program using human subjects who believed they were making independent choices about marriage and reproduction. The patriarch of the family, Jeremiah Kurther, possessed an almost supernatural understanding of human heredity decades before modern genetics would provide scientific explanations for his methods. He had apparently spent years studying the offspring of various family combinations, documenting which unions produced children with desired psychological traits and which resulted in individuals who might pose threats to Kurther's authority. He maintained detailed genealogical records that mapped not just family relationships, but personality characteristics, intelligence levels, and susceptibility to various forms of influence across multiple generations. Federal investigators who examined these records after the Kurther's operation was exposed found documentation that rivaled anything produced by legitimate research institutions. The family had created comprehensive psychological profiles spanning 5 generations, with detailed notes about which genetic combinations produced individuals who were naturally submissive, which created those who were intellectually capable but emotionally dependent, and most disturbingly, which unions resulted in children who displayed what the Kurthers called enhancement traits. These enhanced individuals were the crown jewel of the Kurther's breeding program. Through careful selection and manipulation spanning decades, the family had produced people who possessed unusual abilities that served their criminal enterprise. Some displayed eidetic memory capabilities that allowed them to memorize complex information and serve as living databases for the organization. Others showed enhanced empathic abilities that made them incredibly effective at reading people's emotions and psychological weaknesses. Most valuable were those who combined high intelligence with complete psychological dependence on Kurther's approval, creating individuals who could function in sophisticated roles while remaining absolutely loyal. The method by which the Kurthers maintained control over their breeding program was as ingenious as it was horrifying. Rather than using obvious force, they had created a complex social structure that made cooperation appear to be not just beneficial, but essential for survival. They controlled access to education, medical care, employment, and even basic supplies throughout their territory. Young people who wished to marry had to receive family approval, which was granted only for unions that served Kurther's genetic objectives. Those who attempted to leave the region or marry outside approved bloodlines found themselves facing systematic social isolation, economic ruin, and in some cases mysterious accidents that served as warnings to others. More sophisticated than simple arranged marriages, The Kurthers had developed techniques for making their subjects believe they were falling in love naturally with predetermined partners. They used elaborate social gatherings, controlled information networks, and psychological manipulation to ensure that young people would develop romantic attachments to individuals who had been selected for them years in advance. The subjects experienced all the emotions and sensations of natural courtship, never realizing that their choices had been carefully orchestrated to serve genetic objectives they couldn't comprehend. The family's understanding of human psychology allowed them to maintain control through what they called emotional architecture. They created social environments where desired behaviors were rewarded through community approval, economic benefits, and access to privileges, while undesired behaviors resulted in social isolation and practical hardships. Most importantly, they ensured that the benefits of cooperation were always presented as natural consequences of good character rather than rewards for obedience, maintaining the illusion that their subjects were living in a normal community rather than a controlled breeding facility. What truly set the Kurthers apart from other criminal organizations was their long-term strategic thinking. While other families focused on immediate control of territory or resources, the Kurthers were building something unprecedented, a self-perpetuating criminal dynasty that would become stronger and more sophisticated with each passing generation. They understood that true power came not from forcing compliance, but from creating people who were psychologically incapable of desiring anything other than what served Kurthers' interests. The enhanced individuals produced by their breeding program were trained from childhood to serve specific roles within the organization. Some became intelligence gatherers, using their natural empathic abilities to read the intentions and weaknesses of potential threats. Others served as negotiators and manipulators, capable of convincing law enforcement officials and government agents to overlook Kurthers' activities or provide advance warning of investigations. The most gifted became what the family called architects, individuals responsible for designing and implementing new forms of psychological control that would extend Kurthers' influence into previously unreachable areas. By 1900, the Kurthers had essentially created their own subspecies of humanity. Medical examinations conducted during the federal investigation revealed that their subjects displayed consistent physical and neurological characteristics that differed significantly from normal human baselines. Brain scans showed unusual development in areas associated with social bonding and authority recognition, while genetic analysis revealed markers that suggested systematic selection for traits that hadn't been identified by mainstream science. Most disturbing was the discovery that these characteristics were becoming more pronounced with each generation, indicating that the Kurthers' breeding program was accelerating rather than stabilizing. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through what investigators discovered was an extensive network of enhanced individuals who had been strategically placed throughout the southeastern United States. These agents maintained their psychological connection to the Kurthers family while serving in positions of authority within legitimate institutions. Some worked in government agencies, providing intelligence and protection for family operations. Others served in law enforcement, ensuring that investigations were misdirected or abandoned before they could threaten family interests. Most sophisticated were those who worked in educational and religious institutions, using their positions to identify and recruit new subjects for the breeding program. The economic foundation of the Kurther's empire was built on the systematic exploitation of their subject population. The enhanced individuals produced by their breeding program possessed abilities that made them extraordinarily valuable in various forms of criminal enterprise. Their eidetic memory capabilities made them perfect for complex financial fraud schemes that required tracking multiple false identities and financial instruments. Their empathic abilities allowed them to excel at confidence games and manipulation schemes that generated enormous profits with minimal risk of exposure. Most importantly, their absolute loyalty meant that profits were never diverted by individual ambition or competing interests. The family had also developed what amounted to an internal economy based on genetic potential rather than traditional currency. Individuals who possessed desired traits or who produced offspring with enhanced abilities received access to better living conditions, education, and opportunities within the organization. Those whose genetic contribution was deemed less valuable were relegated to menial roles and subsistence living conditions. This system ensured that the most genetically gifted individuals were motivated to reproduce frequently, while those with less desirable traits were discouraged from having children, accelerating the concentration of desired characteristics within the population. What made the Kurther's operation particularly insidious was how normal it appeared to outside observers. Their territory looked like any other isolated mountain community, with typical cabin homesteads, small-scale farming, and the usual patterns of mountain life. Visitors and even government officials who passed through the area saw nothing obviously suspicious or criminal. The family's control was so complete and so seamlessly integrated into daily life that their subjects displayed none of the obvious signs of oppression or coercion that might have attracted attention. The psychological conditioning that maintained Kurther's control was so sophisticated that most of their subjects were genuinely happy with their lives. They experienced community belonging, purpose, and security that were often superior to what was available in mainstream society. Their enhanced abilities made them valuable and respected within their community, and their genetic programming ensured that they found satisfaction in serving roles that advanced family objectives. From their perspective, they weren't victims of a criminal enterprise, but rather members of a superior community that had achieved levels of cooperation and success that the outside world couldn't match. The federal investigation that eventually exposed the Kurther's operation began when patterns of unusual criminal activity in multiple states suggested the existence of a previously unknown form of organized crime. The criminals involved displayed levels of coordination and sophistication that seemed to require extensive training and organization, yet none of them appeared to be connected to known criminal families or organizations. More puzzling was their apparent psychological profile. They showed none of the typical antisocial characteristics associated with career criminals, yet they demonstrated absolute commitment to criminal objectives that seemed to transcend normal motivations, like greed or power. The breakthrough came when federal agents realized that many of these criminals shared subtle physical characteristics that suggested common ancestry despite coming from widely separated geographic areas. Genealogical research revealed that virtually all of them could trace their heritage back to the same isolated region of eastern Kentucky, specifically to families that had lived under Kurther's influence for multiple generations. This discovery led to the first serious investigation of the family's territory and the gradual uncovering of what federal officials would later describe as the most sophisticated criminal operation in American history. The investigation itself proved extraordinarily difficult because the Kurthers had anticipated exactly this type of scrutiny and had prepared countermeasures decades in advance. Their enhanced agents within government agencies provided advance warning of investigations, while their subjects had been conditioned to provide false or misleading information to outside authorities. More challenging was the fact that most of the criminal activity was being conducted by individuals who genuinely believed they were serving a righteous cause, making traditional interrogation techniques largely ineffective. The end of the Kurthers dynasty came not through direct law enforcement action, but through what federal records describe only as a comprehensive population relocation program that remains classified to this day. In the spring of 1905, every resident of the affected area was removed from their homes and relocated to distant states under new identities. The Kurthers family members themselves simply vanished with no record of arrest, trial, or detention. The entire operation was conducted with such secrecy that even local law enforcement agencies were unaware that it was taking place until after it was completed. The aftermath of the Kurthers investigation had profound implications for federal law enforcement and government policy. Techniques developed for identifying and countering genetic manipulation were incorporated into immigration screening procedures that remain in use today. New protocols were established for detecting and investigating criminal organizations that operated through psychological rather than economic control. Most importantly, federal agencies began developing capabilities for recognizing and responding to threats that transcended traditional categories of criminal activity. The enhanced individuals produced by the Kurthers breeding program posed particular challenges for federal authorities. Many possessed abilities that made them extraordinarily valuable for intelligence and law enforcement work, yet their psychological conditioning made them potentially unreliable if they ever reestablished contact with Kurthers' influence. Some were eventually recruited into government service under carefully controlled conditions, while others were provided with new identities and extensive psychological support to help them integrate into mainstream society. Perhaps most disturbing were the implications of what the Kurthers had achieved. They had demonstrated that human beings could be bred and conditioned to serve criminal objectives with the same systematic approach used for agricultural or animal husbandry. Their success raised fundamental questions about human nature, free will, and the limits of genetic and psychological manipulation that government officials preferred not to contemplate. The complete records of their operation were immediately classified at the highest levels and remain largely sealed today. Modern geneticists and psychologists who have been granted limited access to Kurthers' research materials describe it as decades ahead of contemporary scientific understanding. Their documentation of inherited psychological traits, their methods for predicting genetic combinations, and their techniques for psychological conditioning contained insights that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream science until the late 20th century. Some researchers believe that Kurther's knowledge was incorporated into classified government programs that studied human genetics and behavior modification for intelligence and military purposes. The geographic area once controlled by the Kurther's family was placed under permanent federal oversight and has never been fully resettled. Official explanations cite environmental concerns and unstable geological conditions, but local residents believe the real reason involves lingering effects of whatever the family had done to the land and its people. Wildlife in the region displays unusual behavioral patterns, with animals showing signs of the same enhanced intelligence and social coordination that characterized Kurther's subjects. The legacy of the Kurther's bloodline extends far beyond their immediate crimes into fundamental questions about human evolution and the potential for systematic manipulation of genetic development. They had proven that criminal organizations could achieve levels of sophistication that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and social organization. Their methods influenced government policies on genetics research, population control, and behavioral modification that shaped federal programs for decades. Most troubling is the possibility that Kurther's techniques weren't unique to their family, but represented knowledge that could be replicated by other criminal organizations with sufficient time and resources. The systematic breeding of enhanced humans, the psychological conditioning that made resistance impossible, and the creation of self-perpetuating criminal dynasties established a template that could theoretically be implemented anywhere that geographic isolation and weak government oversight created suitable conditions. Even today, federal agencies monitor genetic research programs and population studies for signs of systematic manipulation that might indicate the presence of criminal organizations using Kurther's methods. Unusual patterns of intellectual development, psychological characteristics, or social organization in isolated communities trigger automatic investigations that often reveal disturbing connections to historical criminal activities. The Kurthers had opened a door to possibilities that law enforcement officials hope was permanently closed with their destruction. The few surviving records of the Kurthers' investigation suggest that the family's ultimate goal was far more ambitious than simple criminal profit or territorial control. They appeared to be working toward the creation of what they called the perfected population, a subspecies of humanity that would eventually replace normal humans through superior intelligence, coordination, and adaptability. Their breeding program was apparently designed to accelerate human evolution in directions that would serve their vision of social organization, with themselves as the permanent ruling class of a new form of human society. The Kurther's dynasty represents the most sophisticated and terrifying example of how criminal organizations could exploit scientific knowledge and isolated geographic conditions to achieve unprecedented forms of power and control. They had essentially created their own species of human being, designed from birth to serve criminal objectives while believing they were living normal, fulfilling lives. Their success demonstrated that the traditional boundaries between criminal activity and crimes against humanity could be crossed by organizations with sufficient ambition and understanding of human psychology and genetics. Their legacy serves as a chilling reminder of what becomes possible when criminal ambition combines with scientific knowledge and geographic isolation to create opportunities for systematic manipulation of human development. The Kurthers had proven that given enough time and freedom from outside interference, criminal families could evolve beyond simple law-breaking to become architects of new forms of human existence, designed entirely around serving their interests and perpetuating their power across unlimited generations. Number 2. The Harvester Clan of Crow's Hollow Ridge. In the winter of 1899, federal investigators found themselves facing what they would later describe as the most sophisticated criminal breeding program in American history. Unlike other families who relied on recruiting outsiders or corrupting existing officials, the Harvesters had taken a fundamentally different approach. They were creating their own criminals from birth, engineering human beings specifically designed to serve their expanding empire of terror and exploitation. The Harvester operation was discovered when census irregularities in 3 adjoining counties revealed population patterns that defied statistical probability. Birth rates were impossibly high, death rates mysteriously low, and most disturbing of all, genetic diversity had virtually disappeared across hundreds of families who claimed no relation to each other. When investigators began tracing genealogical records, they discovered that nearly every person in a 50-mile radius could trace their lineage back to unions that had been arranged, encouraged, or in some cases, forcibly orchestrated by the Harvester clan over the previous half-century. The family compound on Crow's Hollow Ridge was unlike anything federal agents had previously encountered. Rather than a simple homestead, it resembled a small town designed specifically for the systematic production and conditioning of human resources. Multiple residential buildings housed what amounted to breeding populations, each structure designed to accommodate families of specific genetic combinations that served harvester objectives. The layout itself was calculated to reinforce the social hierarchies necessary for their operation, with living conditions improving in direct correlation to an individual's value to the family's criminal enterprise. What set the Harvesters apart from other criminal organizations wasn't just their scale of operation, but their scientific approach to human development. The family patriarch, Mordecai Harvester, possessed an understanding of heredity and human psychology that was decades ahead of his time. He had spent years documenting which genetic combinations produced children with desired traits, which environmental factors enhanced specific abilities, and most importantly, how to psychologically condition individuals from birth to serve criminal objectives without questioning their role or seeking alternatives. The Harvesters had essentially created a human factory, producing individuals with specialized capabilities that served their criminal empire. Some children were bred and trained for physical intimidation, developing unusual size and strength through carefully controlled nutrition and exercise regimens that bordered on torture. Others were cultivated for intelligence and manipulation, raised in environments that enhanced their cognitive abilities while systematically destroying their capacity for empathy or moral reasoning. Most valuable were those who displayed what the family called adaptation traits, individuals who could function effectively in legitimate society while maintaining absolute loyalty to harvester interests. The breeding program itself was horrifyingly systematic. The harvesters maintained detailed genealogical records that mapped not just family relationships, but personality characteristics, intelligence levels, physical capabilities, and susceptibility to various forms of psychological manipulation across multiple generations. They had identified genetic markers that correlated with specific behavioral traits, allowing them to predict with remarkable accuracy what type of criminal operative a particular genetic combination would produce. Young people within harvester territory had no choice in marriage partners. Unions were arranged based entirely on genetic objectives, with individuals who possessed desired traits being forced to reproduce frequently, while those deemed genetically inferior were sterilized or eliminated. The family had created an elaborate social structure that made cooperation appear beneficial while masking the coercive nature of their breeding program. Access to education, medical care, and basic necessities was contingent on genetic value and willingness to participate in reproductive assignments. The psychological conditioning that accompanied their breeding program was equally sophisticated. Children were separated from their biological parents at birth and raised in communal environments where their identities, loyalties, and moral frameworks were systematically constructed to serve harvester objectives. They experienced all the emotions and attachments of normal family relationships, never realizing that these connections had been artificially engineered to ensure their compliance with criminal activities they couldn't comprehend. Most insidious was the harvester's understanding of long-term psychological manipulation. They had learned how to create individuals who genuinely believed they were making independent choices while actually following programming that had been instilled from childhood. These conditioned operatives displayed none of the obvious signs of coercion or mental control that might attract outside attention. Instead, they appeared to be normal, well-adjusted people who happened to excel at criminal activities and showed inexplicable loyalty to harvester interests. The family's criminal empire operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the surface, they ran legitimate businesses that provided cover for their real activities and opportunities to place their specialized operatives in positions where they could gather intelligence and influence decisions. Beneath this facade, they controlled extensive networks of illegal enterprises that generated enormous profits while serving as training grounds for their human products. Their most sophisticated operatives were strategically placed throughout the southeastern United States, serving in positions of authority within government agencies, law enforcement organizations, and business enterprises. These individuals maintained their psychological conditioning while advancing in their careers, providing the harvesters with intelligence networks and protective capabilities that rivaled those of legitimate government institutions. What made this network particularly effective was that most of these operatives didn't realize they were working for a criminal organization, believing instead that they were part of a superior community that deserved success and protection. The harvesters had also developed techniques for converting outsiders into willing participants in their criminal enterprises. Through a combination of psychological manipulation, strategic applications of reward and punishment, and the systematic exploitation of personal vulnerabilities, they could transform normal individuals into loyal agents who served harvester interests while believing they were acting according to their own moral convictions. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through what they called the network, a web of conditioned operatives, corrupted officials, and psychologically dependent communities that allowed them to project power across state lines. They had agents in sheriff's departments, federal offices, and religious institutions who provided advance warning of investigations while simultaneously identifying potential targets for recruitment or elimination. Federal authorities first became aware of the true scope of the harvester operation in 1901 when patterns of unusual criminal activity in multiple states suggested the existence of a criminal organization unlike anything previously encountered. The criminals involved displayed levels of coordination and capability that seemed to require extensive training, yet none appeared connected to known criminal families. More puzzling was their psychological profile. They showed extraordinary commitment to criminal objectives while displaying none of the antisocial characteristics typically associated with career criminals. The investigation that followed required unprecedented coordination between multiple federal agencies and the development of new investigative techniques designed to penetrate psychological conditioning rather than traditional criminal hierarchies. What investigators discovered was a criminal empire that operated more like a biological research institution than a typical organized crime family. The harvesters had created comprehensive documentation of human psychological development, innovative techniques for predicting and controlling human behavior, and systematic methods for converting normal individuals into specialized criminal operatives. Most shocking were the records of their breeding program, which revealed documentation spanning 5 generations of systematic human manipulation. They had maintained detailed psychological profiles, genetic analyses, and performance evaluations for thousands of individuals, treating human beings as livestock to be bred for specific traits and discarded when no longer useful. Some individuals had been held in captivity for decades, used repeatedly for breeding purposes, while being told they were contributing to a righteous cause that would benefit their children and community. The scope of their operations defied comprehension. They had influenced elections, manipulated legal proceedings, controlled business enterprises, and shaped government policies across multiple states through their network of conditioned operatives. They had essentially created a shadow government that operated through psychological control rather than political authority, influencing decisions made by officials who often didn't realize they were being manipulated. The end of the Harvester dynasty came not through direct law enforcement action, but through what federal records describe only as a comprehensive population relocation program that remains classified to this day. In the spring of 1903, every resident of the affected areas was removed from their homes and relocated to distant states under new identities. The Harvester family members themselves simply vanished, with no record of arrest, trial, or detention. The entire operation was conducted with such secrecy that even local law enforcement agencies were unaware of what was happening until after it was completed. The aftermath posed extraordinary challenges for federal authorities. The conditioned individuals produced by the Harvester breeding program possessed capabilities that made them potentially valuable for government purposes, yet their psychological conditioning made them potentially dangerous if they ever re-established contact with harvester influence. Some were eventually recruited into classified government programs under carefully controlled conditions, while others were provided with new identities and extensive psychological treatment to help them integrate into mainstream society. Perhaps most disturbing were the implications of what the harvesters had achieved. They had demonstrated that human beings could be systematically bred and conditioned to serve criminal objectives with the same methodical approach used for agricultural production. Their success raised fundamental questions about human nature, free will, and the potential for genetic and psychological manipulation that government officials preferred not to examine too closely. The techniques pioneered by the harvesters influenced government research programs for decades to follow. Their methods for predicting genetic outcomes, their systems for psychological conditioning, and their techniques for creating loyal operatives were incorporated into classified programs that studied human development for intelligence and military purposes. Some researchers believe that harvester knowledge contributed to the development of psychological warfare techniques and human experimentation programs that shaped government operations throughout the 20th century. The geographic areas once controlled by the harvesters were placed under federal oversight and have never been fully resettled. Official explanations cite environmental concerns and economic factors, but historians suspect the real reason involves lingering effects of whatever the family had done to the communities and individuals under their control. Some residents who were relocated from harvester territory continued to display unusual behavioral patterns and psychological dependencies that suggested their conditioning had permanent effects that couldn't be completely erased. Modern geneticists and psychologists who have been granted limited access to harvester research materials describe their work as containing insights that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream science until the late 20th century. Their documentation of inherited psychological traits, their methods for predicting behavioral outcomes, and their techniques for systematic human conditioning represented knowledge that was decades ahead of contemporary scientific understanding. The complete records of the harvester investigation remain classified at the highest levels of government, with access restricted to researchers working on programs that have never been publicly acknowledged. Some historians believe this continued secrecy suggests that harvester techniques weren't unique to their family, but represented knowledge that could be replicated by other organizations with sufficient resources and freedom from oversight. What remains certain is that the harvester dynasty represented the most systematic and successful attempt at human engineering in American criminal history. They had proven that given sufficient time and isolation, criminal organizations could develop techniques for producing human beings designed specifically to serve illegal enterprises while appearing to be normal, well-adjusted members of society. Their legacy extends far beyond their immediate crimes into fundamental questions about human development and the potential for systematic manipulation of genetic and psychological characteristics. They had created a template for criminal enterprise that emphasized long-term planning over immediate profits, psychological control over physical coercion, and the systematic production of human resources designed to perpetuate criminal activity across unlimited generations. The harvester model demonstrated that criminal families could evolve, beyond simple law breaking to become architects of new forms of human existence designed entirely around serving their interests. They had shown that the traditional boundaries between criminal activity and crimes against humanity could be crossed by organizations with sufficient ambition and understanding of human psychology and genetics. Even today, federal agencies monitor genetic research programs and population studies for signs of systematic manipulation that might indicate attempts to recreate harvester methods. Unusual patterns of psychological development, behavioral characteristics, or social organization in isolated communities trigger automatic investigations that often reveal disturbing connections to historical criminal activities or contemporary attempts to implement similar programs. The Harvester dynasty serves as a chilling reminder of what becomes possible when criminal ambition combines with scientific knowledge and geographic isolation to create opportunities for unprecedented forms of human exploitation. They had proven that criminal organizations could achieve levels of sophistication and control that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and social organization, creating their own subspecies of humanity designed from birth to serve criminal objectives while believing they were living normal, fulfilling lives. Number 1. The Sovereign Lords of Devil's Crown Mountain. On December 21st, 1905, the winter solstice brought more than just the longest night of the year to the remote peaks of eastern Kentucky. It marked the culmination of a criminal empire so vast and sophisticated that federal investigators would later describe it as a nation within a nation, complete with its own government, currency, military, and legal system that had operated in complete defiance of United States authority for over 40 years. The Sovereign dynasty hadn't just built a criminal organization. They had created an alternative civilization that proved it was possible for determined criminals to establish their own independent state within the borders of America, ruling over thousands of subjects who genuinely believed they were citizens of a superior form of government that deserved to replace the corrupt and inefficient democracy that surrounded them. The origins of the Sovereign Empire traced back to 1863, when Colonel Ezekiel Sovereign led a regiment of Confederate soldiers who refused to surrender at the war's end. Instead of laying down their arms, Sovereign declared that the United States government had forfeited its legitimacy through tyrannical actions that violated the Constitution. He and his followers retreated into the most remote sections of the Appalachian Mountains, where they established what they called the Constitutional Republic of Appalachia, a sovereign nation dedicated to preserving true American values through any means necessary. What distinguished the Sovereigns from other post-Civil War resistance movements was their systematic approach to building legitimate governmental institutions rather than simply engaging in guerrilla warfare against federal authority. Colonel Sovereign possessed both military experience and a sophisticated understanding of political theory that allowed him to create functional alternatives to every aspect of federal and state government. The Sovereign Republic operated its own legislative assembly, court system, and executive administration that controlled every aspect of life within their territory. They established their own taxation system, issued their own currency, and maintained armed forces that were better organized and equipped than many state militias. Most importantly, They created a comprehensive legal code that provided their subjects with services and protections that were often superior to what was available from legitimate government institutions. The Republic's Constitution was a masterwork of political theory that combined traditional American principles with innovations designed to address what Colonel Sovereign saw as fundamental flaws in the federal system. It established individual rights protections that were more comprehensive than those in the United States Constitution, created economic policies that provided prosperity for all citizens, and implemented criminal justice procedures that were both more efficient and more fair than those available in state and federal courts. Citizens of the Sovereign Republic enjoyed economic opportunities, educational systems, and social services that were remarkably advanced for their time period. The Republic operated its own schools that provided superior education to children who would otherwise have received no formal instruction. They maintained medical facilities staffed by doctors who had been recruited from legitimate institutions through a combination of ideological persuasion and financial incentives. They even established their own postal system and telegraph networks that provided communication services throughout their territory. The Republic's economic foundation was built on a combination of legitimate enterprises and carefully managed criminal activities that generated enormous revenues while avoiding the violent confrontations that typically brought federal attention to outlaw organizations. They controlled timber operations, mining enterprises, and agricultural ventures that provided employment for thousands of people while generating profits that funded their governmental operations. Their criminal activities were conducted with such sophistication that they rarely attracted federal investigation. The Republic specialized in financial crimes that exploited weaknesses in the federal banking system, government contract fraud that diverted public resources to their territory, and tax evasion schemes so complex that federal revenue agents couldn't understand them well enough to prosecute them effectively. Most importantly, they avoided the violent crimes that typically motivated federal law enforcement action, preferring to use their superior organizational capabilities to outcompete legitimate institutions rather than attack them directly. The Republic's military forces were organized along professional lines that rivaled those of the United States Army. They maintained infantry, cavalry, and artillery units equipped with weapons that were often superior to those available to federal forces. Their soldiers received regular training, standardized equipment, and command structures that emphasized discipline and tactical effectiveness. Most importantly, they understood that their survival depended on avoiding direct military confrontation with federal forces, so they developed defensive strategies that emphasized mobility, local knowledge, and psychological warfare. The Republic's intelligence network was perhaps their most sophisticated achievement. They had operatives in federal agencies, state governments, and local law enforcement organizations throughout the southeastern United States. These agents provided advance warning of investigations, influenced government policies that affected their interests, and gathered intelligence about military operations that might threaten their territory. Some of these operatives were ideological converts who genuinely believed in the Republic's cause, while others were simply corrupted through bribery or blackmail. What made the Sovereign Republic particularly dangerous was their success at winning genuine popular support from people who weren't criminals but who had become disillusioned with federal government policies. During the economic hardships of the 1890s, thousands of families voluntarily relocated to Republic territory, where they found employment, security, and community belonging that wasn't available in the outside world. These citizens weren't coerced or manipulated, but made rational decisions to join a political system that provided better living conditions than what they could achieve under United States authority. The Republic's approach to criminal justice was simultaneously more humane and more effective than what was available from legitimate government institutions. Their courts operated with transparent procedures, competent legal representation, and punishment systems that emphasized rehabilitation rather than simple retribution. Crime rates within Republic territory were remarkably low, not because of fear, but because citizens had economic opportunities and social support systems that eliminated most motivations for criminal behavior. Their educational system produced citizens who were more literate, better informed, and more capable of democratic participation than most Americans of their era. Republic schools taught not just basic subjects, but political theory, economic principles, and moral philosophy that prepared students to be active participants in their government rather than passive subjects of distant authority. Many Republic citizens could articulate sophisticated critiques of federal government policies and propose alternative solutions that demonstrated genuine understanding of complex political issues. The Republic's economic policies created prosperity that was broadly shared among all citizens rather than concentrated among wealthy elites. They implemented land distribution systems that ensured every family had access to productive property, established cooperative enterprises that provided employment security, and maintained social welfare programs that prevented anyone from falling into poverty. Their taxation system was both more fair and more efficient than federal tax policies, generating sufficient revenue for government operations without creating the economic distortions and social resentments that characterized federal fiscal policy. The Republic's foreign policy was conducted with the same sophistication as their domestic governance. They maintained diplomatic relations with several foreign governments that provided them with trade opportunities, military assistance, and political recognition that enhanced their legitimacy. Some European nations were interested in supporting American separatist movements that might weaken United States power, while certain Latin American republics saw the sovereigns as potential allies against American expansionism. Federal authorities first became fully aware of the sovereign republic's existence in 1898, when the Spanish-American War created military manpower shortages that required detailed surveys of potential recruitment areas. Government investigators discovered that large sections of eastern Kentucky were effectively outside federal control, governed by institutions that provided their citizens with services superior to those available from legitimate government agencies. The investigation that followed required the coordination of multiple federal departments and the development of new strategies for dealing with a form of resistance that went far beyond simple criminal activity. The sovereigns weren't just breaking federal laws, they were successfully demonstrating that those laws were unnecessary and that alternative forms of government could provide better results for ordinary citizens. What investigators discovered was a political entity that had achieved many of the ideals that the United States claimed to represent, but had failed to implement effectively. The Republic provided economic opportunity, individual liberty, democratic participation, and social justice in ways that made federal government institutions appear corrupt, inefficient, and oppressive by comparison. This wasn't just a criminal organization that federal authorities could suppress through law enforcement action. It was a competing form of government that threatened the legitimacy of federal authority itself. The end of the sovereign republic came not through military defeat, but through what federal records describe as a negotiated dissolution that remains classified to this day. In the winter of 1905, representatives of the federal government entered into secret negotiations with Colonel Sovereign and other republic leaders that resulted in the peaceful termination of their independent government in exchange for concessions that have never been publicly revealed. Some historians believe the federal government offered republic leaders positions within legitimate institutions that would allow them to implement their political ideas through legal channels. Others suggest that the sovereigns were provided with financial compensation and immunity from prosecution in exchange for dissolving their alternative government. Most intriguingly, some evidence suggests that elements of the Republic's governmental innovations were incorporated into federal policies that were implemented over the following decades. The aftermath of the Republic's dissolution posed extraordinary challenges for federal authorities. Thousands of Republic citizens had to be integrated into the United States political system, many possessing educational and organizational capabilities that made them potentially valuable for government service, but also potentially dangerous if they retained loyalty to Republican ideals. Some were recruited into federal agencies where their skills could be utilized under controlled conditions, while others were relocated to distant states where they could build new lives under different identities. The Republic's territory was placed under direct federal administration for several years, with military personnel overseeing the transition to legitimate government institutions. The process was complicated by the fact that many former Republic citizens genuinely preferred their previous political system and resented being forced to accept federal authority that they considered inferior and illegitimate. The complete records of the Sovereign Republic investigation remain classified at the highest levels of government, with access restricted to researchers working on programs that have never been publicly acknowledged. Official explanations cite national security concerns and the protection of investigative methods, but historians believe the real reason involves the disturbing implications of what the Republic had achieved. The sovereigns had proven that it was possible for a relatively small group of determined individuals to create alternative forms of government that were more effective, more just, and more prosperous than the legitimate institutions they were designed to replace. Their success raised fundamental questions about the nature of political authority, the sources of governmental legitimacy, and the potential for systematic reform of American political institutions. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that the Republic's dissolution hadn't eliminated the ideas and capabilities that had made their success possible. Former Republic citizens retained their knowledge of alternative governmental techniques, their organizational abilities, and their understanding of federal government weaknesses that could be exploited by future separatist movements. Some evidence suggests that Republic veterans were involved in the development of other political resistance movements throughout the 20th century. Modern political scientists who have been granted limited access to sovereign republic materials describe their governmental innovations as containing insights that were decades ahead of contemporary political theory. Their constitutional provisions, economic policies, and administrative procedures demonstrated understanding of political problems that wouldn't be widely recognized by mainstream institutions until the late 20th century. The sovereign republic represents the most successful attempt at creating alternative governmental institutions in American criminal history. They had proven that criminal organizations could evolve beyond simple law-breaking to become architects of new forms of political organization that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying American democracy. Their legacy extends far beyond their immediate political activities into questions about the nature of governmental authority and the potential for systematic reform of political institutions. They had demonstrated that given sufficient isolation and freedom from interference, determined groups could create forms of government that were more effective and more just than the legitimate institutions they were designed to replace. The Republic model showed that the traditional boundaries between criminal resistance and political revolution could be crossed by organizations that possess sufficient vision, organizational capability, and commitment to alternative forms of social organization. They had created a template for political resistance that emphasized institutional building over violent confrontation, popular support over coercive control, and systematic reform over simple opposition to existing authority. Even today, federal agencies monitor political resistance movements and separatist organizations for signs of sovereign republic techniques and capabilities. The systematic creation of alternative governmental institutions, the development of popular support for political resistance, and the implementation of economic and social policies that demonstrate the superiority of alternative political systems continue to represent the most serious potential threats to federal governmental authority. The sovereign republic serves as a reminder of what becomes possible when political ambition combines with organizational capability and geographic isolation to create opportunities for systematic challenges to governmental authority. They had proven that American political institutions weren't inevitable or permanent features of the landscape, but rather human creations that could be improved, replaced, or transcended by organizations with sufficient vision and determination to imagine better alternatives. Their story demonstrates that the most dangerous criminals aren't those who simply break laws, but those who prove that the laws themselves are unnecessary and that alternative forms of social organization can provide better results for ordinary people. The sovereigns had achieved something that no other criminal organization in American history had managed. They had created a working model of a better society that made legitimate government institutions appear corrupt, inefficient, and oppressive by comparison. The 6 families we've explored today represent more than just criminal organizations that happened to operate in the remote mountains of Appalachia. They were pioneers of alternative forms of social organization that challenged every assumption about law, government, and human nature that Americans took for granted. From the Toiver-Martin political warfare machine to the sovereign republic's alternative civilization, these dynasties proved that determined criminals could evolve beyond simple law-breaking to become architects of entirely new forms of human organization. Each family discovered different methods for transcending the traditional limitations that constrained criminal activity. The Malones perfected the art of making people disappear so completely that their existence became questionable. The Ashfords built a criminal empire that operated as efficiently as any legitimate corporation. The Murdochs weaponized human psychology to create systems of control that operated below the level of conscious awareness. The Kurthers engineered their own subspecies of humanity designed specifically to serve criminal objectives. And the Harvesters created a human factory that produced specialized criminal operatives while maintaining the appearance of normal community life. What united all these families was their understanding that true criminal power required more than simple violence or theft. They recognized that lasting success demanded the systematic development of alternative institutions, alternative relationships, and alternative forms of human organization that could compete with and ultimately replace the legitimate structures that surrounded them. Their stories have been deliberately obscured from official histories, not just because of their individual crimes, but because of what their success revealed about the fundamental vulnerabilities in American social and political institutions. These families had proven that the boundary between criminal activity and political resistance was far more permeable than authorities wanted to acknowledge, and that given sufficient time and isolation, criminal organizations could develop capabilities that challenged the authority of the state itself. The techniques they pioneered continue to influence both criminal organizations and government institutions to this day. Their methods for psychological manipulation, systematic corruption, alternative governance, and human engineering have been studied, adapted, and implemented by organizations ranging from international criminal cartels to classified government research programs. The knowledge they developed about human nature, social organization, and the mechanics of power remains relevant to anyone seeking to understand how societies function and how they can be transformed. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that these 6 families may have been merely the ones whose activities were discovered and documented. The isolation and governmental weakness that allowed them to flourish existed throughout the Appalachian region, creating opportunities for similar experiments that may never have been exposed. The mountains still hold their secrets, and some patterns of unusual social organization in isolated communities continue to suggest that the legacy of these criminal dynasties extends far beyond what official records acknowledge. These families serve as a reminder that in the right circumstances, human ambition and intelligence can be directed toward purposes that transcend traditional categories of legal and illegal behavior. They created their own twisted versions of civilization that proved it was possible to imagine and implement alternative forms of human organization, even when those alternatives were dedicated to exploitation, control, and the systematic violation of everything that civilized society claimed to value. Their blood-soaked legacy continues to haunt the mountains where they built their kingdoms of terror, serving as a warning about what becomes possible when criminal intelligence combines with geographic isolation and governmental weakness to create opportunities for the systematic development of alternative forms of human organization. They had proven that the traditional boundaries between criminal activity and political revolution could be crossed by families with sufficient ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness to imagine better ways of organizing human society for their own benefit. The 6 deadliest Appalachian families you won't believe existed weren't just criminals who happened to live in the mountains. They were architects of alternative civilizations that demonstrated the terrifying potential for human creativity when directed toward purposes that challenged every assumption about law, order, and the nature of human society itself. Their stories remind us that the price of freedom and justice is eternal vigilance, not just against those who would break the law, but against those who would prove that the law itself is unnecessary and that humanity is capable of creating forms of organization that are both more efficient and more terrible than anything we dare to imagine.